The deathcap bloomed late that year. Arthur had been watching the patch since early spring, noting the way the pale caps pushed through the mulch in two slow waves, the second always smaller, always more potent than the first. He kept a leather journal for observations like that. 43 pages on fungi alone. His colleagues at the university had stopped asking about it years ago. He knelt at the edge of the bed, pruning shears in his right hand, a clay collection jar wedged between his knee and the soft earth. The morning was windless. That mattered to him because wind muddied everything. The rustle of the garden drowned out the finer vibrations that traveled up through the soil, through the soles of his boots, and into the bones of his feet. On still days, he could feel a rabbit moving 30 paces away. He had learned to read the ground the way other men read faces. He had been deaf in his left ear since he was 19, a fever. The physicians had shrugged and handed him a bill. He had shrugged back and learned to compensate. The shears touched the stem. He applied even pressure, slow and deliberate, the way you had to with death caps if you didn't want the gills to rupture and dust your hands with spores. His wooden cane lay propped against his thigh, its base pressed flat into the dirt. He felt the garden through it like a second spine. Then something hit the ferns. Not a sound first, a weight. The impact rolled through the earth in a low, concussive wave, the kind a falling log made, except the frequency was wrong, too dense, too sudden. Arthur's shears stopped mid-cut. His right hand went still. He felt a second tremor, smaller, a body settling after impact. And then, nothing. The garden absorbed the silence back like water. He set the shears down, carefully. He did not stand immediately. He pressed 3 fingers flat against the cane and waited, reading the stillness. Whatever had landed in the ferns was not moving. It was either dead, or close enough to dead that it no longer had opinions about what happened next. He stood, favoring his right leg as he always did, and picked his way along the stone path toward the far bed. The ferns grew tall this time of year, taller than his shoulder, their fronds knitting together into a dark wall of green. He used the cane to sweep the nearest ones aside. The figure lay face down. His first instinct was size. He had not expected size. The body stretched nearly the full width of the fern bed, shoulders broader than the span of his 2 arms. Legs bent at an angle that suggested she had fallen mid-stride rather than been placed. She wore armor, dark leather, scaled in tight overlapping plates designed to swallow light rather than reflect it. He had seen that pattern once before, on a diagram in a confiscated guild manifest that a city inspector had shown him 3 years ago while asking if he recognized certain botanical compounds. He had recognized them. He had said nothing useful. Syndicate work. The armor absorbed sound the same way it absorbed light, deadening the scrape of scaled plates against each other. A person wearing it could move through dry leaves without a crackle, which meant she had been running hard enough that none of that had mattered. He crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck below the jaw. Her pulse was there, slow, dragging, but present. He noticed the discoloration at the corner of her mouth, a thin rivulet already turning dark at the edges where it had dried, still faintly luminous at the source. He leaned closer and caught the scent before his eyes confirmed it. Nightshade extract. Concentrated. The smell was unmistakable. Something between crushed violet and rotting copper, with an undercurrent of cold metal that sat in the back of the throat long after you pulled away. He had synthesized a variant of it twice for controlled university studies. He knew exactly what it did to a nervous system, and exactly how long the process took once it passed the second stage. Her optic nerves were already compromised. By the time she woke, assuming she woke, the world would be fog and shadow. Arthur sat back on his heels and looked at the cane in his hand. He looked at the pruning shears still lying on the path. He looked at the garden wall, the gate, the road beyond it. A man with more practical instincts would have chosen that road. He knew that. He also knew that practical instincts and botanical training rarely occupied the same mind at the same time, and his mind had already begun cataloging. He reached into the leather satchel at his hip and started counting what he had. The blue petals were on the bottom, wrapped in wax cloth. He had harvested them 4 days ago for an entirely different purpose. He unrolled the cloth and pressed 2 fingers into the bundle, testing moisture. Still viable. He began to work. The garden stayed quiet. Whatever had sent her crashing through his ferns had not followed her here, not yet. He turned her over. It took effort. She outweighed him by a margin that made the task less like moving a person and more like repositioning a fallen shelf unit. All weight, no cooperation. He worked his hands under her shoulder, braced his good leg against the soft earth, and rolled her onto her back in 2 slow stages. His knee complained. He ignored it. The scaled armor clinked once, a dry, muffled sound. And then she was facing the sky, and he could see the full damage. The venom had reached her face. The skin around her jaw carried a faint greenish tinge, most visible at the temples and along the ridge of her lower lip where the blood ran close to the surface. Her pupils were blown wide and filmed over. The irises, a dark amber, he noted, the color of old resin, barely visible behind the milky wash of early paralysis. Her breathing came in slow, uneven pulls, the chest rising and falling with the labor of someone fighting underwater. A long scar ran from her left temple to the corner of her jaw, an old one, white and fully healed, the kind that had been stitched by someone competent but in a hurry. Smaller marks crossed her forearms where the armor gauntlets ended. Not battle scars, too precise for that, too evenly spaced. The kind left by training blades on a proving ground, accumulated over years. Arthur did not dwell on any of it. He was already opening the wax cloth. He crushed the blue petals against the flat of a small stone he kept in the satchel for grinding, working them down into a paste with 2 drops of water from his canteen. The smell rose immediately. Bitter, green, faintly medicinal, the way certain mountain herbs smelled when you broke the stem. Not pleasant, but clean. He had used this preparation twice before, both times on animals he had found in the lower garden, both times with the same understanding. It would slow the venom, not stop it. The nervous system would stabilize temporarily. The creeping paralysis would pause, but the root cause would continue working beneath the surface, patient and indifferent, until it finished what it had started. He pressed the paste under her tongue. Her body responded before her mind did. The jaw clenched, the throat convulsed, and she gagged on the bitterness with a force that snapped her head sideways. Arthur caught her jaw with both hands and held it steady, angling her chin down so she wouldn't swallow wrong. She fought the grip without waking. Instinct, muscle memory, the body's refusal to accept restraint even in unconsciousness. He held on. A woman who had spent years in guild work had developed reflexes that operated independent of thought, and he respected that the same way he respected a thorn, not with fear, but with attention. After a moment, the convulsion passed. Her breathing evened out. The paste absorbed and the lines around her jaw began to soften as the venom's grip loosened its hold on her cranial nerves. He sat beside her in the ferns and waited. The garden stayed still. A bee moved through the death-cap bed, unbothered. The morning light shifted a degree warmer as the sun cleared the wall. Arthur massaged his knee with one hand and watched her chest rise and fall, counting the interval between breaths, tracking whether the rhythm improved. It did, slowly. The blue compound was working. He estimated an hour, perhaps 2, before the temporary relief began to break down. After that, without the root, the venom would resume. He was still sitting there when she opened her eyes. They focused on nothing. He had expected that. Her vision would be near absent now, the optic nerves too compromised for anything beyond vague shapes and gradients of light. But she turned her head toward him with a deliberateness that suggested she knew he was there, had known for some time. She was reading him by sound and breath, the way he read the garden through his cane. He found that mildly interesting. Her right hand moved to her hip. The dagger was still there. She didn't draw it. She wrapped her fingers around the hilt and left them there, and the gesture said everything it needed to say without requiring a word. He didn't move. He had both hands visible in his lap, the empty wax cloth folded between them. He had learned, a long time ago, that stillness communicated more than most speech. She found his wrist before he saw her reach for it. The grip was firm but not punishing, the grip of someone calibrating, measuring the bones beneath the skin. He let her hold it. She turned her face toward him, the filmed eyes searching the vague shape of him, and said it low and rough, the voice of someone dragging words out of a chest that hadn't decided yet whether to keep breathing. The shadows turned on me. 4 words. The whole weight of a betrayal compressed into 4 words, delivered without drama, the way a person stated a weather condition. He thought about that for a moment, the discipline it took to make something catastrophic sound that dry. Then he nodded, forgetting she couldn't see it, and said, "You're in my garden. You were poisoned. I've slowed it." He paused. "The cure is 2 days north, in the Whispering Canyons. I know what we need." She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers stayed on his wrist, reading his pulse the same way he read the earth. Whatever conclusion she reached, she kept it. But she did not let go, and she did not reach further for the dagger. And in the quiet arithmetic of her situation, that was the closest thing to a decision she was willing to make. He helped her sit up against the garden wall. She didn't ask for the help and didn't resist it. She simply allowed it with the neutral tolerance of someone accepting a tool's function. He braced his shoulder against her arm and guided her upright in stages, and she found the wall with her palm and held it there, orienting herself by the texture of the stone. Her breathing had steadied. The paste was working through her system, and the paralysis had retreated from her face and throat, leaving something rawer behind. Not weakness exactly, but a forced stillness, the body under negotiation with itself. Arthur cleared a flat space on the path and laid out what remained in his satchel. 2 sealed vials, a fold of wax cloth, a short-handled knife, dried root shavings wrapped in paper, a half-full canteen. He worked through the inventory by touch and memory, the same way he always did in low light. His left ear caught nothing useful, it never did, but the garden spoke through the ground. Sparrows in the far bed, wind picking up 2 streets over, nothing heavier than that. He prepared a second compound, simpler than the first. Dried bark of the pale willow, ground fine and mixed cold into the remaining water. It wouldn't slow the venom further, but it would ease the inflammation the paste had triggered along her nerve pathways, which would matter in a few hours when the initial relief began to thin and her body registered the full cost of what had been done to it. He stoppered the canteen and set it beside her hand without comment. She found it without looking, drank once, stopped, drank again. Set it down with a precision that suggested she was already mapping the space around her by memory, cataloging distances and surfaces, doing what she had to do now that her eyes were unreliable. He watched her and understood that this was not new behavior. The guild trained for sensory deprivation. She was adjusting, not panicking, and the difference between those two things told him something about the length of her career. "Nightshade extract," he said. "Syndicate formula, not standard." Someone added a mineral compound to accelerate the optic deterioration. He didn't say it to alarm her. He said it because she deserved the accurate information, and because people who operated on incomplete data made worse decisions. "The floral paste will hold for 30 to 40 hours. After that, the paralysis resumes, and the window for the cure closes." She turned her face toward him. The filmed eyes still held their amber color underneath the haze, visible now that the morning light had shifted. "What is the cure?" she said, flat, not quite a question. "A root. Grows in the lower canyon beds, near the underground tributaries. Karath root. It produces a compound that binds directly to the toxin and breaks the molecular chain. One preparation, correctly dosed, and the venom clears completely." He picked up a piece of dried bark and turned it in his fingers. "I've made the preparation twice, once on paper, once in practice. It works." She was quiet for a moment. The wall held her upright, but she had released it with her palm, was sitting under her own support now. "You've done this before," she said. "Not on a person," he said. Another silence, longer this time. He had learned not to fill silences. That was a habit of people who were uncomfortable with what the silence might contain. He waited. A bee crossed the garden again. The same one or a different one, he couldn't tell. 2 days, she said. 2 days to reach the canyon beds, assuming we move at a reasonable pace. 1 day back, if we're not slowed." He looked at her armor, the scaled plates still functional, nothing cracked or punctured from the fall. "The guild will know approximately where you came down. They track their contracts by the venom signature. It's custom work, made for a specific target. When that target doesn't die, someone comes to check." He folded the waxcloth and returned it to the satchel. "We should leave before the afternoon light goes." She took that in without expression. Her right hand had drifted back to her hip, resting against the dagger hilt with the familiarity of long habit, the way another person might hold a railing. He had noticed she defaulted to that contact when processing, not aggression, just orientation. The blade was her fixed point when the world refused to hold still. She pushed herself to her feet. The motion cost her something, visible in the set of her jaw and the brief whitening of her knuckles against the wall. But she completed it cleanly and stood at full height in his garden, and Arthur registered, not for the first time, the sheer architectural difference between them. She cleared him by more than a head. Her shoulders blocked the light from the eastern wall. In the syndicate armor, she looked like a piece of the canyon had decided to stand up and walk. He picked up his cane, his satchel, and his pruning shears. The shears, out of pure habit, returned to their hook beside the garden gate without thought, and unlatched the gate. The road beyond was empty. The morning smelled like warming stone and the distant river. He stepped through. After a moment, he heard her boots on the path behind him, the scaled armor silent, the footsteps still slightly uneven from the venom's residual grip on her balance. She was compensating. She would compensate better by tomorrow, and worse again the day after, when the paste began to fail. 30 hours. He had done harder calculations with less. The road north held for half a day before it stopped pretending to be a road. It narrowed first, the packed earth giving way to loose gravel and exposed root, then to a rough track worn by deer and seasonal water rather than cartwheels. The trees thickened on either side, the canopy closing overhead until the sky became a suggestion rather than a fact. Arthur had traveled this route 3 times before, always alone, always with more time than he had now. He knew where the ground turned soft near the creek crossing, and where the slope above the second ridge released loose stone in wet weather. He navigated by that accumulated knowledge, testing each surface with his cane before committing his weight. Morak walked a pace behind him. She had found a rhythm for it. Not following exactly, but tracking the sound of his cane against the ground and matching her stride to the information it produced. When the cane struck solid rock, she stepped firm. When it probed soft earth, she shifted her weight to the edge of the path where the root systems made the ground harder. She had figured this out within the first hour without being told, and he had noted it and said nothing, because pointing it out would have made it a lesson rather than what it actually was, which was competence. Her vision had stabilized at what he estimated was roughly 10% function, enough to distinguish daylight from shadow, enough to register movement at close range, not enough to read terrain or identify threats at distance. She didn't complain about it. She asked practical questions when she needed information, and otherwise used her remaining senses with a focused economy that he found, professionally speaking, impressive. She identified a game trail branching left by smell alone, confirmed it as deer by the height of the disturbed brush. She heard the creek crossing a full 2 minutes before he felt it through the cane. The whispering canyons earned their name before they came into view. The sound reached them first, a low, continuous murmur that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite water, the product of air moving through hundreds of narrow rock channels simultaneously, each one a slightly different pitch, the combined effect unsettling in the way that certain silences were unsettling. Arthur had read 3 separate geological accounts of the canyon system and still couldn't fully explain the acoustics. He had stopped trying. The entrance was a gap between 2 red rock faces, wide enough for a cart at the base and narrowing steadily as the walls rose. Vines covered the lower third of both faces, the thick, clinging kind that rooted in the rock's mineral seams and grew sideways as readily as up, making the walls look draped rather than bare. The path inside was uneven flagstone, ancient work, predating anything the current settlements had built. Whoever had laid it hadn't been planning for comfort. The stones were functional in size and irregular in spacing, as if the builders had used whatever the canyon floor provided and considered the result sufficient. Arthur moved to the left wall and pressed his palm flat against the rock. The stone vibrated faintly, not the vibration of movement, but the baseline resonance of air passing through the channel network above. He registered it, filed it, and lifted his cane again. He would need to calibrate for the canyon's ambient noise before he could reliably read intrusion through it. That would take time he didn't entirely have, but it would take less time than being surprised. Behind him, Morak had stopped at the entrance. He heard her boots still on the flagstone, heard the faint sound of her drawing a slow breath through her nose. "Old blood," she said. "In the rock. Old enough it's just mineral now, but it's there." She wasn't offering conversation. She was giving him information, the same way he had given her information about the road. He accepted it the same way she had, without ceremony, just noted. They moved deeper in. The walls rose on both sides until the sky narrowed to a pale strip overhead, the light reaching the canyon floor in a filtered, directionless way that flattened shadow and made distance hard to judge by eye. Arthur relied on the cane more heavily here, sweeping it in a wider arc, reading the density of the vines and the spacing of loose stones on the path. His knee had begun its usual afternoon complaint, a deep ache that radiated up into the hip when the terrain demanded too much lateral adjustment. He had managed it for 11 years. He managed it now. The vines thickened as they pushed further in, hanging across the path in curtains that had to be parted by hand. They were damp despite the dry weather, fed by water seeping through the rock from the underground tributaries below. Arthur noted the moss coloration on the lower stones, darker here than at the entrance, the deep green-black of constant moisture. The Karoth root grew near those tributaries, which meant the moisture was increasing as it should. They were moving in the right direction. Morak pushed through a curtain of vines beside him and paused, tilting her head at a slight angle, listening to something in the canyon's ambient murmur. He waited. She had earned the right to her instincts. After a moment she moved again, saying nothing, which he interpreted as nothing immediate, rather than nothing at all. Her boots scraped the flagstone more than they had on the open road. The venom's grip on her balance tightened in enclosed spaces where her remaining vision provided no useful horizon to compensate against. She didn't adjust her pace for it. She adjusted her center of gravity instead, dropping her weight fractionally lower with each step, the way a sailor walked a tilting deck. The canyon curved right ahead, the path bending around a column of rock that had partially collapsed at some point and been left where it fell. Arthur measured the gap between the column and the wall with his cane. Enough room, but not comfortable room. He went through first, turning sideways, and waited on the other side while she navigated it by touch, one hand trailing the column and the other trailing the wall. She came through and straightened, and for a moment the two of them stood together in the narrow space beyond the bend, the canyon walls close, the murmuring air moving past them both. The afternoon light had dropped another degree, the strip of sky overhead turning from pale blue to something cooler. They had covered reasonable ground. They had not covered enough. The canyon wind died between one breath and the next. Arthur felt it before he registered what it meant. A shift in the ambient vibration through his cane, the baseline murmur of air through rock channels dropping suddenly to a register so low it was less sound than pressure. The vines stopped moving. The canyon went from quietly alive to carefully still. And that specific quality of stillness, the kind produced by things choosing not to move rather than things having nothing to move, sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He dropped. Not a stumble, a deliberate, fast collapse to a crouch, his bad leg folding under him, his left hand grabbing Morak's sleeve and pulling down with his full weight behind it. She went with it cleanly, no resistance, the combat instinct reading the urgency in his grip before her mind had processed the reason. The knife hit the tree above them a half-second later, the impact a hard, dry thunk that sent a tremor down the trunk and into the root system, readable as a struck bell. He felt it through his palm on the ground. Close. 4, maybe 5 meters above where their heads had been. They held low against the flagstone. Arthur pressed his free hand flat to the path and closed his eyes, filtering. The canyon's ambient pressure had changed further. Not the random shifts of air, but the specific dampening effect of bodies positioned against surfaces, absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. He counted the disruptions. 2 points, possibly 3, distributed across the vine-covered walls ahead. The syndicate hunters used the canyon the way they used their armor, becoming part of the surface, and the canyon's acoustic complexity made that easier than it had any right to be. But weight still pressed on stone, and stone still spoke to those who listened. He reached into the satchel at his hip and closed his fingers around a bulb the size of a large fig, firm-skinned, heavy with the fluid inside, the acid sap he harvested from the canyon's own plants and had carried for exactly this kind of situation. He had made 4 of them before leaving the garden. He wished now he had made 8. He lobbed the first one underhand into the dense vines to the left of the path, aiming for the wall section where the dampening had been strongest. The bulb hit the vines and burst. The sap didn't explode, it spread, a fast, wet bloom across the surface, eating through the vine fibers and hitting the rock beneath with a hiss that rose sharply in the closed canyon air. A figure dropped out of the vines, the camouflage cloak shedding its hold on the wall surface as the sap dissolved the adhesive compounds worked into the fabric. The figure landed badly, one knee hitting the flagstone, and made a sound. Morak's dagger left her hand before the sound finished. She had been tracking the figure's fall by the disruption it made in the air pressure, by the scrape of the cloak against stone on the way down. And the throw was not a guess. The blade covered the distance in the time it took Arthur to register she had moved, and the figure on the flagstone stopped moving entirely. She had already drawn the second blade. She was still crouched, her head angled, listening. He pressed 2 fingers to her forearm, not a grip, just contact, and tapped twice toward the right wall, where the second dampening point was. She shifted her weight fractionally, orienting. He took the second acid sap bulb and threw it wide and high into the vines on the right, deliberately short of the target point, and watched the sap spread. The hunter on the right moved to avoid it, and that movement broke the surface contact, and the moment it broke, Morak was already turning. She crossed the distance in 4 strides and hit the hunter while he was still pulling free of the vines, the impact brief and without ceremony. The canyon wall absorbed most of the sound. Arthur was already scanning the third point, but the pressure there had changed. It was moving, retreating back along the wall toward the bend they had come through. He considered throwing the third bulb and decided against it. 2 enemies confirmed and neutralized, 1 withdrawing. Spending resources on a retreating target was a poor calculation when the supply was finite. He kept the bulb. The canyon settled back into its murmur. Not entirely. There was a new layer in it now, the sound of disturbed vines resettling, the faint drip of acid sap working through plant matter to the stone below. Morak retrieved her thrown dagger from the flagstone, wiped the blade on the dead hunter's cloak without looking at what she was doing, and sheathed it. Her hands were steady. He had not expected otherwise, but he noted it regardless. He pushed himself upright, the bad knee registering its opinion of prolonged crouching, and studied the wall where the hunters had been positioned. The adhesive compound in the cloaks left a faint residue on the rock surface when it broke contact, a pale, slightly tacky film, nearly invisible in normal light but present once you knew to look. He filed that away. It meant he could potentially read occupied positions before they moved, given sufficient light and proximity. That information had a specific value that increased as the canyon narrowed ahead. Morak stood beside him, both blades sheathed, her breathing unchanged from what it had been before the ambush. She was looking at the wall, or looking toward it. The distinction had ceased to be meaningful. "You felt them through the stick," she said, not a question. He confirmed it without elaboration. She took that in with the same neutral economy she applied to most new information, turning it over once internally and placing it somewhere useful. "How many do you think followed us in?" she said. He told her he wasn't certain. Probably more than 3, and likely fewer than 8, based on the track they had left leaving the city, and how long it would have taken the guild to organize a pursuit after losing the venom signature. She said nothing further. They moved on. The third acid sap bulb went back into the satchel. Arthur kept his palm on the cane and his attention on the ground, reading the canyon through its own language, and the vines murmured around them as they walked deeper in. The cave was more of a shallow concavity in the canyon wall than a true cave. A recess where the rock had fractured inward at some point and left a space roughly 4 meters deep and wide enough for 2 people to sit without their shoulders touching. The ceiling sloped low at the back, forcing a crouch, but the opening faced away from the main path, and the overhang above it broke the sight line from the canyon walls. Adequate. Arthur had stayed in worse. He built the fire small and set it against the back wall so the light didn't project outward into the canyon. Dry wood only, sourced from deadfall already inside the recess, the kind that had been desiccating long enough to burn without smoke. He used a thumbnail of tinder and 1 strike. The flame caught and held, and the cave filled with a low, orange warmth that pressed back the canyon chill. Morak sat near the entrance with her back against the rock, both blades across her knees. She had positioned herself precisely, close enough to the fire's warmth to feel it, far enough from the light that her silhouette didn't project outward past the overhang. Guild training, or 11 years of staying alive, or both. She was scanning the canyon opening with eyes that couldn't scan anything, her head making the small, slow movements of someone reading sound and air current rather than light. Arthur settled near the fire and drew the wooden mortar from the satchel. He had 3 portions of dried root shavings left, the supplementary compounds he had packed that morning with the specific intention of managing the venom's secondary effects. Inflammation, nerve sensitivity, the bone-deep ache that set in as the body metabolized the blue paste's binding agents. He began grinding, the pestle working in slow circles, the rhythmic thud filling the cave with a quiet, domestic sound, completely at odds with the canyon outside. His knee was bad. Not crisis bad, familiar bad. The specific grinding discomfort that came after sustained, uneven terrain, the joint having exhausted whatever tolerance it had built up through years of botanical fieldwork and now presenting its accounting. He worked the mortar with one hand and pressed the other against the knee, massaging in slow circles, applying the kind of counter-pressure that didn't fix anything, but reminded the surrounding muscle that it still had a function. 11 years of this particular negotiation. He was practiced at it. The fire popped once. The dried wood shifted and resettled. Arthur divided the ground root into 2 portions, wrapped one in paper and set it aside, and mixed the second with a careful measure of water from the canteen, working the compound to the correct consistency. It needed to be thin enough to absorb quickly, but not so dilute that the active components dispersed before the tissue could use them. He had made the calculation often enough that it no longer required conscious thought, just attention. He held the canteen toward Morak without standing. She heard the motion, or felt the displacement of warm air, and reached out and took it from him without fumbling. She drank in measured amounts, 3 swallows and a pause, the way someone managed hydration when they couldn't be certain of the next water source. She handed it back the same way he had offered it, extended into the space between them, handle first. He watched her without watching her, the way he watched everything, peripherally, through sound and motion, and the small information that accumulated at the edges of direct attention. She was monitoring the cave entrance with her chin slightly raised, using the upper register of her hearing the way he used the vibration of the ground. Her fingers rested on the blade across her knees without gripping it, maintaining contact without tension. He thought about the scar along her jaw, the training marks on her forearms, the way she had read the ambush from his grip on her sleeve. No hesitation and no wasted motion. She had been doing this a very long time. The canyon outside murmured its low, continuous sound. Nothing in it changed. No new pressure, no dampening, no weight moving against stone. The retreating hunter had not returned yet, or had returned quietly enough that the canyon wasn't telling him about it. Both possibilities required the same response, which was to rest, eat, prepare, and be ready to move at whatever pace the morning demanded. He poured the mixed compound into the second wooden cup and set it near her hand on the cave floor, close enough that she would find it when she reached. "Drink that slowly," he said. "It's bitter. It'll ease the nerve sensitivity before it gets worse tonight." She found the cup, tilted it once to confirm the volume, and set it back down without drinking immediately. She would drink it when she decided to drink it. He returned to his mortar. The fire burned steady. The cave held its warmth. Outside, the canyon vines shifted in the slow air current that moved through the rock channels after dark. A sound like breathing, low and rhythmic. Arthur finished grinding the second portion and wrapped it carefully, his hands moving through the familiar sequence without hurry. The knee throbbed once, hard, then settled back into its baseline complaint. He pressed 2 fingers against it and held the pressure until the muscle released, a technique a physician had shown him years ago. Not a cure, just a management strategy, like most things. Morak lifted the cup and drank in 3 slow measures. She lowered it, held it in both hands, and said nothing. The fire pulled the lines of her face into sharp relief and deep shadow, the healed scar a pale line against the orange light, the filmed eyes catching the flame in the way that fogged glass caught light. Present, but unreflective. She looked tired, in the way that people look tired when they had been running on discipline alone, and the discipline had finally noticed the body's condition and registered a complaint. He thought about the timeline. 22 hours of the paste remaining, roughly. The Karath beds were still a full day's walk into the canyon, assuming no further interruption. The math was tight but functional, the way most survival math was tight but functional. Which was to say, it worked precisely as long as nothing went wrong. He set the mortar aside and leaned back against the rock, taking weight off the knee, and listened to the canyon breathe around them. The spasms hit her 2 hours before dawn. Arthur was awake when it happened. He slept lightly at the best of times, and the canyon's acoustics made deep sleep a poor strategy regardless. He had been sitting with his back against the cave wall, the fire burned down to coals, running the next day's route through his memory, when he heard the change in her breathing. A sharp intake, held, and then the sound of her boots scraping against the cave floor as her legs contracted. He crossed the space between them in 4 steps. She had slid down the wall from her seated position, her body curled inward, both hands locked into rigid claws at her sides. The daggers had fallen. He heard them hit the stone a half-second before he reached her. 2 distinct impacts, one ringing clean and one flat, depending on which face of the blade struck first. Her jaw was set hard, the muscles along her neck standing in cords, the whole body fighting the spasm the way a bow fights being drawn past its range. He had read about this stage of the blue paste's metabolic cycle. Reading about it and watching it were different experiences. He picked up both daggers from the cave floor and slid them into his own belt, one on each side. Then he knelt beside her and did the only thing that had any practical value in that moment, which was to put a hand on her shoulder and keep it there. Steady pressure, not restraint. Something fixed in the moving. She couldn't use her hands, couldn't reach her blades, couldn't do anything except endure the compound's war with the venom in her bloodstream. And he understood, without needing to reason through it, that a person who had spent their entire adult life being the most dangerous thing in any given space would find that specific helplessness worse than the physical pain. The spasm peaked and held for a long count, then broke. Her body released in stages, the legs first, then the torso, her hands uncurling slowly, the fingers straightening with visible effort. She was breathing hard through her nose, the controlled breathing of someone who had been taught to manage pain by systematizing it, giving it a rhythm to follow. He kept his hand on her shoulder until her breathing normalized. Then he reached for the canteen. He raised it to her lips himself. She didn't take it from him. Her hands were still unreliable, the fingers not fully responding, and he simply held the canteen at the right angle and let her drink at her own pace, a few drops at a time, the way you hydrated someone whose system was working too hard to process volume. She drank without comment. The firelight had dropped low enough that the cave was mostly shadow, the coals throwing just enough light to work by. A second spasm came before the first had fully released its tension from her muscles. Shorter than the first, but harder. Her shoulder drove back into the cave wall, and he felt the impact through his palm, the force of it enough to bruise stone if the angle had been different. He held his position and kept the pressure steady. There was nothing else to do. The compound was doing what it was designed to do, fighting the venom's hold on her nervous system at the cellular level. And the body's experience of that process was not a thing he could intervene in, only wait through. It passed. She lay against the wall, breathing, her eyes open and fixed on the middle distance, the filmed amber tracking nothing. The canyon outside continued its low murmur. The coals ticked as they cooled. He could feel her awareness of the daggers at his belt. Not suspicion, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The instinctive accounting of a person whose survival had always depended on knowing exactly where their weapons were and exactly who had access to them. The blades had been in her possession since she was, by his rough estimate, old enough to have earned them the hard way. Having them on someone else's body, even temporarily, even out of plain practical necessity, was the kind of thing that would sit wrong regardless of circumstance. He left them where they were. Taking them back prematurely, before her hands could hold them reliably, would be a worse kindness than the discomfort of their absence. A third spasm came, lighter than the second, the compound's progress evident in the diminishing intensity. He raised the canteen again when it passed, and she drank, and this time her right hand came up partway, not enough to take the canteen, but enough to rest against his forearm while she drank. A stabilizing contact, purely functional. He didn't acknowledge it. It didn't require acknowledgement. Between the third and fourth spasm, in the window of quiet that stretched longer than the previous ones, she spoke, low, addressed at the ceiling rather than at him. "The first time I was poisoned, I was alone." A pause, the length of a slow breath. "I survived it because I had nothing else to do." He said nothing, waiting to see if there was more. There wasn't. He understood the statement for what it was, not confidence, not gratitude, just the dry notation of a person marking the difference between then and now, filing it in the category of facts that didn't yet have an assigned meaning. The fourth spasm was brief, and the fifth didn't come. Her body worked through the remaining metabolic peak over the following half hour, the tension draining out of her muscles in slow increments, and by the time the eastern sky above the canyon had shifted from black to the deep gray of pre-dawn, she was sitting upright under her own support again. He drew the daggers from his belt and held them out, handles forward. She took them without ceremony, the grip reflex immediate, the blades disappearing to their sheaths in the same practiced motion he had seen before. Her hands were still faintly unsteady. She sheathed both blades without acknowledging the tremor, and he did not acknowledge it either. He put more wood on the coals and built the fire back up for what remained of the dark. The fire rebuilt itself from the coals in the slow, deliberate way of small fires. First a glow, then a tentative flame, then something that committed. Arthur fed it in stages, thin pieces first, then progressively denser, the way you brought a system back to function after stress. The cave warmed by degrees. Outside, the canyon held its pre-dawn quiet, the murmur reduced to its lowest register, the air barely moving. Morak sat with her back against the wall and turned the daggers over in her hands. Not examining them, she couldn't examine them, not visually, but running her thumbs along the flat of each blade in sequence, checking the edges, the balance, the integrity of the grip wrapping. The same check she had probably run every morning for years, adapted now to work without eyes. Her hands had steadied. Not completely. A faint tremor still lived in the left one, but the right was clean, and the muscle memory was intact, the fingers finding every detail of the familiar surface without needing to search. Arthur ground the remaining root shavings into the mortar, working slowly, his knees stretched out in front of him toward the fire's heat. The warmth helped. It didn't fix the joint. Nothing fixed the joint. But it reduced the morning stiffness that always accumulated overnight when he'd spent the previous day on uneven terrain. He worked the pestle in even circles and let the quiet settle around them both. She spoke first, which surprised him mildly. "How does a man who walks with a cane survive a canyon full of hunters?" Not hostile, direct, the tone of someone clearing up a factual gap that had been sitting unaddressed. She held one dagger flat across her palm, testing its balance point with the focused attention of someone whose hands were doing the seeing. He considered the question as it deserved. "Carefully," he said, and then, because that was too thin to be useful, "The cane reads the ground. The canyon has a language, vibration, pressure, the way sound moves differently around a body than around empty air. I've been learning it for 11 years. He tipped the ground shavings into the cup and measured water against them. "I'm not fast, and I'm not strong. I'm early. Most threats, if you read them early enough, don't require speed or strength to manage." She absorbed this. Her thumb found a nick in the blade's edge, slight enough that most people wouldn't feel it, and her expression shifted fractionally. Not quite displeasure, the professional notation of a craftsperson identifying a defect. She reversed the blade and worked her thumbnail along the nick's profile, measuring its depth. "You threw that sap bulb before I heard them move," she said. "I felt them through the path." The adhesive compounds in guild cloaks have a specific density. When it contacts stone, it changes the surface's resonance. He handed her the cup without announcing it, just extending it into the space near her right hand where she had established her reach. She took it. "I've been studying the Syndicate's materials for 3 years, academically. They use 6 botanical compounds in their adhesives, 4 of which I can identify by the vibration signature they produce." She drank, set the cup down, picked up the second dagger, ran the same check. "Why were you studying their materials?" "Because they were interesting," he said. "And because the city inspector kept asking me questions I could only half answer, and I disliked the incompleteness." He picked up the empty cup and turned it in his fingers. "Why does an elite guild blade end up carrying a poison specifically designed to destroy her own optic nerves?" The fire shifted. A small log settled and threw a brief surge of light across the cave. She didn't answer immediately, the silence running long enough that he read it as a decision about how much to release, rather than a reluctance to speak. "The contract I was given 3 weeks ago had 2 targets," she said. "I completed the first. The second was a child." She sheathed the dagger with a clean click. "I declined." He said nothing. The canyon murmured outside. "The guild doesn't accommodate declinations," she said. The flatness in her voice carried the specific weight of a person describing a law of physics rather than a grievance. This was how things worked. She had understood that when she declined, and had declined regardless, and the consequences had followed with the mechanical predictability of cause and effect. Arthur looked at the cave wall and thought about that for a moment. The calculation she had made, what it had cost, what she had known it would cost when she made it. The paste he had pressed under her tongue in his garden. The 30-hour window. The 2 daggers he had carried through her worst hour because her hands couldn't hold them. He thought about the guild hunter retreating back along the canyon wall, and what that hunter's return would bring. "The Karath beds are approximately 6 hours from here at yesterday's pace," he said. "Faster if the path improves after the second bend." He returned the mortar to the satchel and began packing what remained of the camp in the methodical sequence he always used, the sequence that ensured nothing was left and nothing was packed inaccessibly. "Your vision will degrade further today as the paste thins. By this evening it will be mostly light and shadow." He said it the same way she had described the guild's response to her declination, as a fact that required accurate acknowledgement rather than softening. "I'll need to adjust the signals we used yesterday." She stood and rolled her shoulders, testing the morning stiffness in her muscles, the residual tension the spasms had left in her upper back. He heard the quiet crack of joints resettling. She picked up her cloak from the cave floor and settled it across her shoulders with the ease of long habit, the motion entirely independent of vision. 2 taps, stop, she said. Your grip on my sleeve. Drop. A pause. What's the signal for ambush left versus ambush right? He looked at her. She was facing the cave entrance, her head slightly angled, already listening to the canyon's pre-dawn register. He thought for a moment about economy, a system simple enough to execute under pressure, clear enough that it survived noise and speed and the specific cognitive load of combat. He pressed 2 fingers briefly against her left shoulder, then her right. She nodded once. The daggers were already in her hands. They left the cave as the sky above the canyon shifted from gray to the flat, directionless white of early morning. The path had changed overnight. Water had moved through the canyon in the dark. Not a flood, just the slow redistribution of underground seepage onto the surface, the flagstones slick in patches, the gaps between them filled with a pale mineral silt that hadn't been there the previous afternoon. Arthur tested each stone before weighting it, the cane reading the difference between stable rock and surface that would shift under load. His pace was slower than he wanted. The timeline pressed against him in the back of his mind like a thumb against a bruise, present and consistent, not yet critical. Morak moved behind him with her hand trailing the wall. She had adopted the technique without discussion somewhere in the first hour, her fingertips reading the rock's texture and irregularity to hold her lateral position on the path. Her boots still scraped occasionally on the wet flagstone, the venom's remaining grip on her balance more pronounced this morning than yesterday, the pace beginning its slow withdrawal from her nervous system. She compensated with her center of gravity the way she had the day before, and she said nothing about the difficulty of it. The canyon narrowed as they moved deeper, the walls pressing in until the path required them to walk single file with no margin. The vine coverage thickened proportionally, the hanging curtains denser, damper, the moisture content of the rock rising as they descended toward the underground tributaries. Arthur read the moss on the lower stones and found what he was looking for, the transition from dark green to the near black coloration that indicated constant water below. They were approaching the right depth. Another 2 hours, possibly less. He slowed his pace when the canyon floor changed. The flagstones gave way to packed earth here, the ancient path submerged beneath centuries of organic accumulation, and the earth was covered in puffball fungi. Not scattered, not occasional, a continuous carpet of them stretching the full width of the canyon floor for as far as the path extended, the pale spheres ranging from the size of a closed fist to the size of a head, packed close together, their skins tight with the spores they contained. He had encountered them before in lower canyon terrain, had read their properties in 2 separate botanical surveys, and had carried that knowledge in the category of hazards to avoid rather than hazards to use. His perspective on that categorization had shifted somewhat in the last 24 hours. He stopped completely and tapped Morak's shoulder twice. She froze. Immediately, completely, both feet planted, hands at her sides. No hesitation, no request for explanation. He had given the signal, and she had acted on it with the same clean response she had shown every time he had used their established system. The trust entirely functional, entirely practical, nothing sentimental about it. He appreciated that specifically, that she treated his signals the same way she treated confirmed intelligence, as actionable data rather than suggestion. He crouched and examined the nearest cluster. The skins were at full tension, the spores mature and pressurized, the slightest sufficient force sufficient to rupture them. Mature puffballs released their payload in a directed cone, the initial dispersal following the path of least resistance, which, in the enclosed canyon, would be upward and outward along the walls. The dust itself was not immediately dangerous in small quantities. Disorientation, visual distortion, impaired coordination, effects that built with dosage and peaked at roughly 10 minutes of exposure. He had noted all of this in the abstract. He was noting it now with considerably more attention to the tactical implications. He turned and found her elbow, guiding her forward one careful step at a time, threading a route through the densest clusters toward the narrower margin where the canyon wall met the earth. The fungi thinned near the base of the wall, rooted less readily in the drier mineral soil at the rock's edge. He moved them through this margin in a slow, deliberate sequence, his cane placed with precision between each sphere, her boots following his lead exactly, her free hand still trailing the wall for reference. Halfway through the field, he stopped. He pressed his palm to the rock face and felt something he didn't like. A faint but organized pattern of vibration moving through the stone from somewhere above, too regular for wind, too distributed for a single animal. Boots on the canyon rim, multiple contacts spread wide, moving in a coordinated arc that would put them above the puffball field within the next several minutes. The retreating hunter from the previous day had not retreated far, had retreated exactly far enough to report. He kept the information internal, finished moving them through the field, and only spoke when they reached the solid flagstone beyond it. "They're above us," he said quietly, "on the rim, spreading to cut off the path ahead." She had already drawn one blade, the motion so habitual it had happened below the threshold of conscious decision. "Not yet," he said. She held the blade but didn't sheath it. He turned and looked back at the puffball field behind them, then up at the canyon walls, then at the strip of white sky overhead where the rim would be in another 100 meters. He thought about the wind pattern in the lower canyon, the way air moved consistently from the tributary depth outward toward the entrance in the morning hours, a reliable thermal current produced by the temperature differential between the underground water and the surface. He thought about the hunters dropping from the rim above the field. He pulled the cloth from his satchel and handed it to her, guiding her hands to understand what it was. She raised it to her face without being told. He tied his own across his nose and mouth and turned back toward the field, the cane already moving, reading the positions of the nearest clusters. 6 hours of paste remaining, perhaps less. The Karath beds were behind the hunters, on the far side of whatever they were about to walk through. The canyon wind moved at his back. He picked a line through the field and followed it. They cleared the puffball field without disturbing a single sphere. Arthur counted his steps on the far side and stopped at 12, enough distance that a disruption behind them wouldn't reach. His pulse was running faster than he preferred. Not fear exactly, the specific heightened attention of a person who had just moved through a significant hazard and was now recalculating what came next. He removed the cloth from his face and folded it into the satchel. Morak lowered hers and stood with both blades drawn, her head turning in the slow, systematic arc she used to read the canyon's sound layers. The walls above them were still. No vibration through the rock, no organized pressure against the stone. The hunters on the rim were either holding position or moving with enough care to avoid detection, and the distinction mattered considerably. He pressed his palm to the nearest wall and held it there, filtering the canyon's baseline murmur from anything purposeful beneath it. Nothing yet. But the thermal current at his back had shifted. Not direction, just temperature, dropping a half degree in the last few minutes, the way canyon air dropped when bodies occupied the rock above and interrupted the surface's heat exchange. Small information. Reliable information. He guided them forward along the path, moving at a pace that balanced speed against the need to read the ground properly. The flagstones had returned after the fungi field, older here, the edges worn smooth by water rather than foot traffic, the gaps between them wider. His cane found a loose stone and redirected before he weighted it. Morak matched his pace behind him, her trailing hand finding the wall when the path narrowed, releasing it when the canyon opened. The system between them had become efficient enough that it required almost no active management, just attention. The path curved left around a column of banded rock, and beyond the curve the canyon widened into a short natural chamber before narrowing again at the far end. Arthur registered the space and its acoustics simultaneously. The wider chamber would carry sound differently. The hunters above would know that, would use the narrowing at the far end as a choke point if they were planning to descend. He filed this and kept moving. The pebble came down the right wall without warning. Small, loose, the kind that dislodged constantly in canyon terrain, from nothing more than thermal expansion in the rock. The sound it made was ordinary. The echo it produced was not. The canyon chamber multiplied and distributed the sound in a way that would have obscured its origin entirely to anyone relying on hearing alone. Arthur felt it through the cane before it struck the chamber floor, the vibration of its descent transmitted through the wall's contact with the path, and he felt what traveled with it. Weight. Distributed, careful, deliberate weight, pressed against the upper rock in a pattern too organized for anything except people who had trained to move quietly on vertical surfaces. Multiple contacts. Not 2 or 3, more. He pressed his free hand flat against the chamber wall and counted the distinct vibration signatures, each slightly different in frequency based on body mass and the specific adhesion of their cloaks against the rock. 4 on the right wall, descending in a staggered line. At least 2 more on the left, holding position. 6 total, possibly 7. He kept walking. He did not change his pace. Changing pace would signal detection and accelerate their timeline. Morak's blades were already drawn. She had felt the change in his cane rhythm through the path, or read it in his breathing, or simply in the accumulated information of 2 days spent translating his body's responses to the world. She drew level with him on the wider section of the chamber, close enough that he felt the displacement of air when she moved, and spoke low and direct, barely above the canyon's ambient sound. "Let me take the open path. You take the rocks on the right." He understood the logic immediately. She was offering herself as the visible threat, the thing the hunters would orient on when they descended, while he worked the walls with the acid sap. It was a sound, tactical calculation. She had the blades and the combat training. He had the sap and the knowledge of where the hunters were pressing against the stone above them. Split the hunters' attention, exploit the division. He also understood that she was positioning herself blind in an open space against 6 trained hunters, relying on hearing alone, and that the canyon's acoustic complexity would make that hearing unreliable in the chaos of a full engagement. He kept that assessment internal. She knew her own capabilities more accurately than he did. "Not yet," he said. Same words as before, same register. Her jaw tightened fractionally, the instinct to act pressing against the instruction to hold. She held. "They haven't committed to descending. If we move before they do, we choose a ground that favors them." He felt the vibration in the walls, the 6 positions still moving slowly, the adhesive cloaks maintaining surface contact, descending in the staggered pattern of hunters who had been given a specific formation to hold. "When they come down, they'll expect us to run toward the far end." "The narrowing," she said. "The narrowing," he confirmed. He looked back along the chamber toward the puffball field behind them. Then at the far end, the path compressing back to single width between 2 close walls. Then, up at the strip of sky overhead, the rim just visible, the thermal current moving consistently at his back. The canyon wind was still moving outward, still carrying toward the entrance. That mattered. That was the only thing that mattered right now, and the hunters descending the walls above them had no way of knowing he understood why. He put his hand into the satchel and closed his fingers around the third acid sap bulb. One remaining after this one. He needed to be exact about when he spent them. The vibration in the walls intensified. They were coming down. The path ended 40 meters ahead. Arthur had known it would. He had traveled this canyon system 3 times, and the chamber's far end terminated at a sheer drop into the underground river that fed the tributary beds below. The Karath root grew in the soil along those banks, which was precisely why the path went there, and precisely why it went no further. The river had carved the canyon floor away over centuries, leaving a vertical face of 8 or 9 meters dropping into fast black water. In better circumstances, he had rigged a rope descent and climbed down to the root beds with a collection bag and a morning to spare. These were not better circumstances. He moved them toward it anyway. The hunters were descending behind them, the vibration through the path telling him they had fully committed to the walls now, the adhesive cloaks engaged against the rock faces on both sides of the chamber. They were moving fast, faster than the approach had suggested, the formation abandoning caution for speed. They had seen their targets moving toward the dead end and had drawn the obvious conclusion. Cornered. Nowhere to go. Close the distance before the botanist throws anything else. He heard the first of them land on the path behind him. A contained impact, trained landing, minimal sound but enough vibration through the flagstone to confirm boots on the ground. Then a second. The chamber's acoustics flattened the sounds into something ambiguous, but the path didn't lie. He kept walking. Morak stayed at his shoulder, blades down, reading his pace. He could feel the tension in her proximity, the specific pressure of a person holding themselves at the edge of action, waiting on a signal that hadn't come. The drop appeared in front of them as the path's flagstones gave way to bare rock, and then to nothing. The mist rose from the river below, cool and constant, the spray reaching his face as he stepped to the edge and looked down. The water moved fast in the narrow channel, white where it broke against the submerged stones, black where it ran deep between them. The far bank was visible, low and dense with the dark soil that indicated the tributary feed. He could see the root beds from here, the distinctive serrated leaves of Karath plants clustered along the waterline, green-black, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years cataloging their properties. 40 hours of work, 30 meters away and completely inaccessible. Behind them, the hunters had reached the chamber floor. He heard the formation spreading across the path's width, filling the space methodically, cutting off any return toward the puffball field. He counted the footfalls through the flagstone. 6 distinct contacts. The 7th, if there was a 7th, was either still on the wall or had taken a different position entirely, which was a variable he noted and couldn't resolve with the information available. Morak turned to face the chamber without being told. She stood between him and the hunters, blades up. Her weight settled into the forward stance he had seen her use before engagement. Feet wide, center of gravity dropped, the posture of someone preparing to generate force rather than receive it. She couldn't see the formation spreading toward them. She was reading it through the air displacement and the sound the hunter's boots made against the stone, assembling the picture from fragments the way she assembled everything now. He stepped beside her. She said, low, "Get behind the rocks." A flat instruction, no discussion attached to it. The rocks, she meant, were a low scatter of fallen canyon wall along the right edge of the path, adequate cover for a man with a cane and limited options. She had identified them by touch on the way through, cataloging the space the way she always catalogued spaces now, building a map she could use without eyes. He looked at the rocks. He looked at the hunters, still approaching, the camouflage cloaks making them difficult to resolve visually, even at this range in the chamber's flat light. He looked at the puffball field, 100 meters behind the hunter's formation, and at the canyon walls rising above it, and at the strip of sky overhead where the thermal current moved steadily at his back, outward from the tributary depth, carrying toward the entrance. "My cane is just a piece of wood," he said. She turned her head a fraction toward his voice, caught off guard by the non sequitur. "But my timing is exact." He held the third acid sap bulb in his right hand, the last puffball cluster positions mapped in his memory from the crossing, the wind direction fixed and reliable. He looked at the hunters and calculated the distance, the ceiling height, the width of the canyon at the field's location, the volume of spore dispersal per ruptured cluster under the current air pressure. The math was tight. It was the same quality of tight as everything else had been since she had crashed into his ferns, which was to say, it was workable if nothing additional went wrong. He gripped the cane and looked at the approaching formation and thought about the child the guild had contracted her to kill, and about the venom someone had designed specifically to take her eyes, and about the 6 hunters spreading across the chamber floor with the professional confidence of people who had correctly identified a dead end. "When I move, stay with me," he said. She didn't answer. The blades turned once in her hands, the practiced rotation of a person settling their grip. He took that as confirmation. The hunters closed the last 20 meters. He moved toward them. Not fast. He couldn't move fast. The cane and the knee and the uneven flagstone made fast a theoretical concept rather than a practical one. But he moved with enough purpose that the formation hesitated, the hunters recalibrating for a target that was advancing rather than retreating. He had counted on that hesitation. People trained to close on cornered targets needed a half-second to adjust when the target stopped being cornered, and half a second was sufficient for what he needed to do. He threw the acid sap bulb at the nearest hunter's feet. Not to wound. At this range, the sap would damage equipment and cause pain, but the real function of the throw was displacement. The hunter stepped back and left, and the formation opened a gap in its center, and Arthur walked through the gap with his cane sweeping the path in front of him, and Morak 2 steps behind, close enough that he felt the air move when she turned to keep the hunters in her hearing. They didn't pursue immediately. They reformed, which cost them 4 seconds. And those 4 seconds carried Arthur and Morak past the chamber's widest point and into the narrowing path beyond, back toward the puffball field. He could feel the hunters behind him now through the flagstone, 6 distinct contacts accelerating, the formation abandoning its spread and compressing into a column to fit the narrowing path. That was what he needed. Compressed. The thermal current hit his back, steady and reliable, moving outward from the deep canyon toward the entrance. The fungi field was 30 meters ahead. He could see the pale spheres in the path's flat light, the carpet of tight-skinned puffballs covering the canyon floor from wall to wall, and he was already choosing his line through the margin at the wall's base, the same dry strip they had threaded that morning. He turned his head back toward Morak and pressed 2 fingers to her left forearm. "Stop here." She planted immediately, both blades up, facing the pursuing formation. He kept moving, threading the wall's margin into the field's edge, the cane finding the dry soil and reading it clear of roots. He needed a specific cluster, not the nearest ones. Those were too close to the margin. Their spore cones would disperse laterally rather than centrally. He needed the dense clusters in the field's middle third, the ones with the tightest skins and the highest spore pressure. He found them 8 meters in, a cluster of 7 spheres packed close against each other, the largest the size of a melon, the skins drum-tight. He planted his cane, braced his weight, and kicked the cluster with the flat of his boot. The sound was a soft, percussive thump, almost gentle. And then the spores rose in a column of dense yellow dust that the canyon's thermal current caught immediately and carried outward along the path in a rolling cloud. exactly as he had calculated. The adjacent clusters caught the pressure wave and ruptured in sequence, each one feeding the next, the chain reaction moving through the field's middle third in a spreading wave that produced more dust than he had precisely estimated, which was the correct direction for a calculation error to land. He was already moving back toward the margin when the cloud reached him, his cloth up and tied before the first sphere ruptured. His eyes streamed. He kept them mostly closed, navigating the margin by the cane and the wall's texture against his shoulder. The dry strip stayed clear of the worst dispersal. The current was carrying the bulk of the cloud centrally, down the path's main line, directly into the formation that had been 30 meters behind them and was now considerably closer. He heard the hunters enter the cloud. The sounds that followed were disordered. Coughing, the scrape of boots losing coordination on the flagstone, a body contacting the wall and sliding, the particular acoustic signature of people whose spatial processing had been chemically interrupted, trying to maintain formation through muscle memory alone. The spores worked fast at concentration. He had noted that in the botanical surveys. He was noting it again with more appreciation for the precision of the documentation. He reached Morak and put his hand on her back. He tapped once, the confirmation signal they hadn't formally established, but that she read correctly regardless. Clear to move. She was already reading the sounds from the cloud with her head angled forward, the amber eyes tracking motion she couldn't see through the haze, her body processing the acoustic information into position data with the speed of someone who had been doing exactly this for weeks rather than hours. He pressed his palm flat between her shoulder blades and felt her breathing, steady and controlled, the spasm damage from the previous night nowhere evident in her posture. He began tapping. Not words, a rhythm, the system they had established in the chamber, left shoulder for left threat, right shoulder for right, but expanded now into something more continuous, a running commentary and pressure and cadence. 2 quick taps, target, center, close. A pause. 3 taps, slower, moving left. He felt her weight shift before he finished the 3rd tap, the response time fast enough that the signal and the action were nearly simultaneous. She moved into the cloud. He stayed at its edge, one hand maintaining contact with her back as long as reach allowed, then losing contact and switching to her shoulder as she advanced, then to her upper arm, walking with her into the dispersing edge of the yellow haze, the cloth over his face doing adequate work at this concentration. Through the cloud's noise, he read the flagstone with his cane and translated what he found into his hands, tapping direction and distance, adjusting for the hunter's movement as they registered through the path's vibration. The first hunter went down to his left. He felt the impact through the ground. He tapped twice on her right shoulder, and she pivoted, and he felt the brief, controlled violence of it through the air pressure beside him. And then she was turning back toward the center on his next signal before the motion had fully completed. The yellow dust thinned as the thermal current carried the dispersal onward. The canyon went quieter by degrees. The cloud thinned from the edges inward, the thermal current doing its work, pulling the yellow dust along the path toward the canyon entrance in a slow, diffusing river. Arthur kept his cloth up and his cane reading the flagstone, and he kept his hands on Morak, and the 2 of them moved through the dissolving haze like a single organism with 2 separate functions. He felt the hunters through the path. 4 down, confirmed through the vibration signatures that had stopped moving and stayed stopped. 1 moving erratically along the right wall, the coordination loss severe enough that the body was defaulting to surface contact for orientation, hands dragging against the rock. 1 more, somewhere in the cloud's center, moving in tight circles that indicated the spores had hit the vestibular system hard. The hunter's spatial processing attempting to recalibrate against information that had stopped being reliable. He tapped Morak's right shoulder once. She turned. He tapped twice more in quick succession, indicating distance. Close, within 4 meters. She advanced toward the wall, and he followed, one hand on her back, the cane reading the ground ahead. The hunter against the wall heard them coming, and pushed off the rock, reaching for something at the belt. The motion telegraphed through the flagstone's vibration as a shift of weight toward aggression. Arthur tapped her shoulder hard, once, the urgency clear in the pressure. She closed the distance in 2 strides, and the engagement was brief and entirely one-sided. The last hunter in the cloud center was moving less by the time they reached him, the disorientation compounding on itself, the circles tightening as the vestibular system lost its remaining reference points. He was coughing, the sound wet and ragged, the spore concentration having been highest at the field's center, where the chain rupture had peaked. Arthur tracked the movement through his cane and tapped Morak's left shoulder, adjusting direction twice as the hunter's path shifted unpredictably. She waited for the third adjustment, the one that gave her a consistent bearing, and then she moved. The canyon went quiet, not gradually. Suddenly, the way a room went quiet when the last voice stopped. The coughing ceased. The scraping of disoriented boots against stone ceased. The only sounds remaining were the canyon's baseline murmur, the distant rush of the underground river, and their own breathing. His somewhat elevated behind the cloth, hers controlled and even in the way it had been controlled and even throughout. Arthur lowered the cloth from his face. The air tasted of mineral dust and the faint bitterness of the puffball compound, already dispersing to manageable levels. His eyes had stopped streaming. The canyon path ahead was clear in both directions, the yellow haze now only a thin residue drifting above the flagstones, thinning further with each passing second as the thermal current carried it outward. Morak lowered her blades. She stood in the middle of the path with her chest rising and falling in the unhurried rhythm of someone who had just completed sustained physical work and was allowing the body to return to baseline without rushing the process. The daggers hung at her sides, points down, her wrists loose. The haze rendered her outline soft at the edges, the dark, scaled armor absorbing what little light filtered through the dissipating dust. He could not see her expression clearly from where he stood, but her posture had the specific quality of stillness that followed decisive action, not relief, not triumph, the neutral settling of a person who had done what the situation required and was now simply present in the aftermath. He leaned on his cane. The bad leg had been informing him of its opinions for the last 20 minutes with increasing clarity, the adrenaline that had been managing the pain now receding and leaving the joint to speak for itself. He let it speak. He had no pressing need to move for the next several minutes, and the ground was solid beneath the cane, and that was sufficient. She turned toward the sound of his breathing. The filmed eyes found his approximate location with the accuracy she had been building over 2 days of reading him by ear and air displacement and the vibration of his cane against the stone. She crossed the distance between them and put her hand on his shoulder. Not gently, firmly, the grip of someone checking structural integrity, confirming that the thing they were relying on was still functional. He straightened slightly under the contact, taking more weight onto the cane, and she felt the adjustment and reduced the pressure without removing her hand. He looked at the path behind them, at the hunters motionless on the flagstone, at the puffball field beyond them now largely spent, the ruptured clusters collapsed and flat. He looked at the canyon walls, reading their surface for the adhesive residue that indicated occupied positions. Nothing. No dampening in the ambient pressure, no organized weight against the rock. 6 hunters confirmed on the path. The 7th position, the one he had never resolved in the chamber, remained unaccounted for, and he held that fact in the front of his mind where it belonged. He tapped her hand on his shoulder twice. She released it. He turned back toward the deep canyon and the dead end and the river below it, and thought about rope, and about the collection bag in the bottom of his satchel, and about the 8 or 9 meters of vertical rock face between the path's edge and the Karath beds on the far bank. "The root beds are below the drop," he said. "I have rope, not enough to descend and return cleanly, but enough to descend." He worked through the remaining variables without pausing. "The current is fast, but not deep at the near bank. If I go down to the beds and you hold the rope from above, the return is manageable." He looked at her hands, the slight residual tremor in the left one still present. "I'll need your grip." She said nothing for a moment. He heard her register the request, not the mechanical part of it, the rope and the grip, but the part underneath it. The part where a man with a bad leg and 40 hours of adrenaline behind him was proposing to descend a canyon wall on a short rope over fast water, while she held the other end with hands that were still recovering from the previous night's spasms. "How much does the rope need to hold?" she said. "Just me," he said. "I don't weigh much." The canyon murmured around them. Somewhere below, the river moved fast over its stones, indifferent and continuous. The rope was 8 meters of braided plant fiber, kept in the satchel's bottom pocket for the same reason he kept the acid sap bulbs. Not because he had planned for this specific situation, but because a botanist who worked alone in canyon terrain and didn't carry rope was a botanist who had not thought carefully about canyon terrain. He had thought carefully about it. The rope was old but sound, the fibers tight and unfrayed, tested against his body weight on 3 previous descents at other sites. He tied one end around the most reliable anchor available, which was a column of intact rock at the path's edge that had been standing long enough to have stopped moving. He tested it with his full weight twice, letting the rope take the load while he read the column's contact with the canyon floor through the vibration in the line. Solid. He coiled the remaining length and handed it to Morak, guiding her hands to the correct grip position. Two-handed, the rope passing behind her hip for friction, her weight as the counterbalance. She adjusted the grip before he finished showing her, the hands finding the mechanical advantage on instinct. Her left hand was steadier than it had been that morning. Not fully recovered, the tremor is still present at rest, but under load, the muscle engaged cleanly, the grip firm and consistent. He tested it by pulling the rope with his full weight from a crouch and feeling how she held. She held without shifting her feet. He stood up and looked at the drop. 8 meters was not a long descent. He had done longer with better equipment in better condition. He went over the edge with the rope running through his hands and his boots finding the rock face, moving in the slow, controlled sequence of someone who understood that urgency on a rope over fast water was a method of generating new problems rather than solving existing ones. His knee registered the wall's angle against his boots, and he adjusted his weight distribution accordingly, keeping the load on his arms where he could manage it consciously. The mist from the river reached him 4 meters down, cool and constant, the spray fine enough to see only an aggregate. The wall was wet here, the rock dark and slick, the holds requiring care. He found them carefully. The rope ran steady above him. No slack, no give. She was holding his weight against her hip with the consistency of a fixed point, the grip not varying with the effort of it. He reached the bank. The Karath beds were dense along the waterline, exactly where they should have been. The serrated leaves dark and waxy, the root systems visible where the river had undercut the bank and exposed them. He crouched and worked fast, not frantic, but fast, the economical speed of someone who had done a task many times and knew exactly what they needed and where to find it. He pulled the collection bag from the satchel and began cutting roots at the correct depth, 2 fingers above the primary node, the same way he had practiced on specimens at the university. The knife was sharp. The roots came free cleanly. He needed 6 mature roots for a full preparation. He counted as he cut, checking each one against the criteria: diameter, coloration, the specific density of the flesh that indicated full maturity. The 5th root he cut was too young, the flesh pale and underdeveloped. He moved along the bank and found a better specimen 3 meters further. 6 roots, all sound. He sealed the bag and stood. The ascent was harder than the descent. It always was. His arms had the accumulated fatigue of the day behind them, and the wall was wet, and his knee had been objecting for the last 2 hours with genuine conviction. He moved upward in stages, resting his weight against the rope between moves, letting Morak take the load while he found the next hold. She took it each time without adjustment, the counterbalance steady and consistent. He focused on the rock in front of his face, and the placement of each boot, and the grip of his hands, and nothing else. The way you managed a hard physical problem by reducing it to its immediate components. His hands reached the path's edge and found the column, and he pulled himself over the lip and sat on the flagstone with his back against the rock, and his bad legs stretched out in front of him, and the collection bag in his lap. His arms were shaking. He noticed this with the detached interest of someone observing a factual condition, and let them shake. Morak released the rope and coiled it without being asked, her hands moving through the task by feel. She set the coil against the column and crouched beside him, not touching him, close enough that he felt the displacement of air and the warmth the scaled armor had accumulated through the day's exertion. She was reading him the way she read everything now, by breathing, by the small sounds of a body under fatigue, by whatever information the air between them carried. He opened the collection bag and checked the roots in the canyon's flat light, running his fingers along each one. All 6 intact, no damage from the descent or the cutting. He had prepared the compound before under controlled conditions, in a proper laboratory with proper tools. He had the mortar, the knife, the canteen, and sufficient knowledge of the process that the missing equipment was an inconvenience rather than an obstacle. He began working. He ground the first root against the mortar's stone in slow, even strokes, the sound low and rhythmic in the quiet canyon. The compound released as he worked, the smell rising, clean, astringent, with the faint mineral edge that distinguished Karath root from the dozen other species with similar leaf structures. He worked through all 6 roots, combining the preparations into a single measure, adding water in the precise ratio by eye and by the compound's consistency against the pestle. He had calibrated that consistency on paper so many times that his hands knew it without instruction. He handed her the mortar. She took it in both hands and held it level, feeling the weight of the preparation against the stone. A pause, not hesitation, the pause of someone registering the significance of an object before using it. He watched her raise the mortar and drink the preparation in 3 measured swallows, the same controlled intake she used for everything. No drama in it. She lowered the mortar and held it in her lap and waited. The Karath compound worked faster than the blue paste. He knew the mechanism. It bound directly to the venom's molecular structure, rather than competing for the same neural pathways, and the binding reaction was exothermic, perceptible as a brief warmth in the tissues it passed through. He watched her face. After 2 minutes, something changed in the muscles around her eyes. A release of tension he hadn't fully registered was there until it was gone. Her jaw loosened by a fraction. She raised one hand and pressed 2 fingers against her temple, feeling whatever the compound was doing to the pressure behind her eyes. She lowered her hand, turned her face toward him with the deliberate angle she used when reading him by ear. But her eyes moved with it this time. Not the filmed searching of the last 2 days, not the unfocused amber tracking shapes and gradients. They found his face, stayed there. The haze was receding, the optic nerves clearing as the venom's molecular chain broke apart under the compound's action. It would take another hour for the full effect, but the direction was already clear. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking, her expression doing something complicated that her face wasn't entirely practiced in showing. The canyon murmured around them. The river moved below. The afternoon light had dropped to the warm angle that preceded dusk, laying long shadows across the flagstone. He leaned his head back against the rock and closed his eyes, listening to the canyon breathe, and felt the tight arithmetic of the last 2 days finally release its hold on the back of his mind. They stayed on the flagstone until the light changed. Not because they had decided to, but because neither of them moved, and after a while the not moving became its own kind of decision. The canyon shadows lengthened across the path, the warm afternoon light retreating up the walls in slow degrees, and the air cooled by increments that were perceptible only in aggregate. Arthur kept his eyes closed and his back against the rock, and listened to the canyon's murmur shifting into its evening register, lower and more diffuse, the thermal currents reversing as the surface temperature dropped and the underground water began to dominate the air exchange. Morak sat beside him. He heard her breathing steady and slow over the first 20 minutes as the Karath compound moved through her system, the tension the venom had been maintaining in her tissues releasing in stages. Occasionally she turned her head and he heard the small sounds of someone testing a sense that had been absent, the slight adjustment of focus, the almost imperceptible catch in the breath when something resolved clearly for the first time in 2 days. He didn't ask her what she was seeing. She would tell him what was relevant and leave the rest where it belonged. After a long while, she said, "The canyon is red." Flat, a simple observation, delivered the way she delivered most things. He opened his eyes and looked at the walls, the banded rock catching the dusk light in deep ochre and rust, the vines throwing long shadows across the color. "I thought it would be gray," she said. "From the sound of it." He considered that. The idea of building a visual world from acoustic information, assigning colors to surfaces by the way sound moved against them, constructing something entire and coherent from the wrong sense entirely. "Gray is a reasonable inference," he said. She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal, somewhere between the two. He pushed himself upright and began packing the remaining materials from the preparation. The mortar, the knife, the spent root cuttings wrapped in paper for disposal away from the canyon floor. He didn't leave botanical material in environments where it hadn't originated. The rope went back into the satchel last, coiled and secured. His hands moved through the sequence automatically, while his mind ran the return route, cataloging what remained of the path in both directions, and settling on the entrance as the better option, despite the longer distance. The hunters on the flagstone behind them were a known quantity. What lay deeper in the canyon was not. Morak had been watching him pack. He was aware of it. The quality of attention she directed at something was distinct from inattention, a focused presence that registered even peripherally. "The paste residue will clear over the next day," he said, pulling the satchel strap across his shoulder. "Drink as much water as you can manage tonight. The compound works faster with adequate hydration, and you'll sleep better without the neural inflammation." She said nothing, which he had learned meant she had heard and would act on the information without requiring the transaction of an acknowledgement. They walked back through the canyon in the evening light. The puffball field was largely collapsed, the spent clusters flat and dry, the yellow residue settled into the soil. Arthur navigated the margin by habit, the route memorized from 2 crossings. Morak walked beside him now rather than behind, the path wide enough here for it, and she moved without touching the wall, her balance returned, her boots finding the flagstone cleanly. He watched this peripherally and noted the particular quality of it, not the compensated movement of someone managing a deficit, but full, unconsidered motion, the body working as it was meant to work. They passed the hunters on the path without discussion. She looked at them once and looked away, the expression on her face doing nothing that he could read clearly, which was probably accurate to what was actually there. He noticed the 7th hunter's position as they passed the right wall of the wider chamber. The adhesive residue was present on the rock face, a pale film at the 3-meter height, but the residue was old, already drying at the edges, the kind left by a cloak that had broken contact some hours ago. The seventh had withdrawn early. He noted the timing. Before the spore cloud, before the chamber encounter. Someone had pulled back while the situation was still unclear, which meant someone had been watching and assessing, and that someone had made a different calculation than the others. He filed it and kept walking. The canyon entrance appeared ahead as the last of the dusk light held the sky above the rim in a band of pale amber. They passed through the gap between the rock faces, and the canyon opened behind them into the wider landscape, the trees thickening on either side of the track, the evening air warmer and less mineral than the canyon's interior. He felt the ground change underfoot, packed earth again, roots, the familiar texture of the track they had taken north. His knee noted the transition and registered a cautious approval. Morak stopped at the canyon entrance and turned back to look at it. He stopped beside her and waited, following her gaze to the red walls, the narrowing gap, the vines hanging dark in the fading light. She stood there long enough that it became a deliberate act rather than a pause, and he understood, without needing to reason through it, that she was looking at it because she could. Because 2 days ago looking had been reduced to gradients and shadow, and she was now settling a debt with the visual world that she had been running for 40 hours. They made camp a kilometer from the entrance, in a sheltered hollow where a fallen tree provided a windbreak and the ground was dry. He built the fire small and low, and set the water to warm in the tin cup he carried for the purpose, adding the last of the dried bark compound for the inflammation that would continue to ease through the night. She sat across the fire from him, blades sheathed, shoulders loose, the posture of someone whose body had stopped requiring constant tactical preparation and was cautiously exploring what the absence of that requirement felt like. He handed her the warm cup. She took it in both hands, the left one steady now, the tremor resolved by the compound's work through the day. She drank slowly and looked at the fire, and he looked at the fire. And the evening settled around them with the specific quality of quiet that followed sustained effort. Not empty quiet, the kind that had weight and texture, the kind that meant something had been completed. After a while she spoke. In the guild, trust was a liability they trained out of you in the first year. She said it to the fire rather than to him, the words coming in the dry, factual register she used for information from her past. You trusted your own judgment, your own eyes, nothing that could be compromised by someone else's choice. A pause, the length of a slow breath. My eyes were gone, and I was still alive. She turned the cup in her hands. Because of your hands. He looked at his hands, the mortar stain on the right one, the rope burn across the left palm from the descent. He thought about the rhythm he had tapped on her back through the spore cloud, the way she had moved on his signals with the precision of someone whose trust had been not given, but verified, confirmed at each step by evidence rather than feeling. He thought that was probably the only kind of trust that held in the long run, the kind that had been tested and had not broken. He didn't say any of this. She knew it. The canyon had been a long conversation conducted entirely in pressure and timing and the language of bodies working in proximity under sustained difficulty. And the conclusions of that conversation didn't require translation into words. The fire settled. An ember shifted and threw a brief light across the hollow. Somewhere in the trees behind them, an owl located something in the dark and descended on it without sound. He refilled the cup and handed it back, and she took it, and the night moved around them both, unhurried and indifferent, carrying the smell of cooling rock and distant rain. He picked up his cane and ran his thumb along its length, feeling the new notch near the base where it had struck stone during the cloud. He would sand it smooth when he was back in the garden. He thought about the garden, the death-cap bed, the pruning shears on their hook, the 43 pages of fungal observations in the leather journal on the workbench. The ordinary dimensions of his ordinary life, waiting with the patience of things that don't know they've been left. Morak set the empty cup on the ground and leaned back against the fallen tree, her eyes half closed, watching the fire from under the weight of 2 days' accumulated exhaustion. She did not reach for the daggers. She left her hands open in her lap, palms upward, the blisters from the rope work visible on her right palm in the firelight. New marks on old hands added to the record. The fire burned. The night deepened. The rain arrived quietly, a light sound on the leaves above the hollow, and the fire held beneath the fallen tree's shelter, and neither of them moved, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had been earned rather than merely arrived at.